You walked away quietly, and that's what destroyed them. You didn't scream, you didn't beg, you didn't demand answers or validation, you didn't perform a grand exit for sympathy or vengeance. You simply stopped showing up. You stopped giving them access to your mind, your heart, your energy, and that silence, that calm, collected walk into your future, that's what broke them, because they expected chaos. They expected a reaction. They expected you to chase, to prove your worth to someone who had already devalued you, but you didn't. And that restraint, that discipline, was the most powerful move you ever made. It's a strange thing, you know, how people take for granted what is always present, always loyal, always giving. They confuse your patience for weakness, your forgiveness for foolishness, and your quiet endurance for blindness. But you weren't blind. You saw everything. You saw the manipulation, the subtle cruelty, the way they tested your love while offering none in return. And you still stayed longer than you should have, not because you were weak, but because you believed in redemption. You believed in growth. You believed they could change, but they didn't. And eventually you realized that staying was slowly killing your spirit. And so you left, not with a storm, but with stillness. And in that stillness, you took something they never thought they'd lose: your presence, your support, your ability to see the good in them, even when they didn't deserve it. You took back the sacred power they used to feed their ego and numb their guilt. And that absence, that void you left, it screamed louder than any confrontation ever could. You see, when you stop reacting, you force them to sit with what they've done. You remove the distractions, the justifications, the blame games. All that's left is the truth. And the truth is, they broke something that was never going to come back. That's the cost of betrayal. It's not always paid in immediate suffering. It's paid in the long, lonely silence of being ignored by the very person they thought would never walk away. Because here's the brutal irony. They wanted control. They wanted dominance, but they were addicted to your energy, your light, your devotion. And when you withdrew it all without theatrics, they lost the drug they didn't even realize they were hooked on. You were the mirror that made them feel human. And now without it, they have to face the distorted reflection of what they've become. You didn't destroy them with revenge. You destroyed them with peace, with detachment, with the maturity to walk away from a fire you could have easily fueled. That's the mark of true strength, not reacting when provoked, not engaging when tempted, but knowing your worth so deeply that silence becomes your sword and dignity your shield. They underestimated you. They thought your kindness was submission, that your consistency was dependence. But in reality, you were simply giving them a chance to evolve, to love better, to be better. They failed that test. And now the universe is teaching them a lesson you no longer have to participate in, because the pain they feel now, that's the echo of your absence, the ghost of a soul they damaged for sport, and it will haunt them far more than any angry words ever could. They wanted to win. But what they lost was irreplaceable, because people like you don't come around often. You're rare. You're real. You're not easily broken, but once you break, you don't return. You love deeply, yes, but you heal with wisdom. And healing sometimes means disappearing from the lives of those who only ever saw your presence as a guarantee, not a gift. Now they watch you thrive, maybe from afar, maybe in silence, but they watch. And what they see terrifies them, not because you've become bitter or cold, but because you've become better. You've transformed your pain into power, your silence into a statement, your suffering into strength. And that strength speaks volumes. You chose yourself, finally, and in doing so, you exposed the truth that they were never the source of your worth. They were simply the test of it. And when you passed that test by walking away, they failed. They failed to see your value, failed to rise with you, failed to love you in the way you deserved. So now let them sit in the ruins of their own choices. Let them wrestle with the consequences they never thought would come. Let them feel the absence they swore would never matter. You don't need revenge. You don't need closure. You don't need anything from them. Because the greatest revenge is peace. The kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop trying to prove yourself to people who never deserved access to your heart in the first place. You walked away quietly, And that silence, that was the loudest scream they ever heard. They never expected the silence. In fact, they were prepared for anything but that. They were ready for a fight, for the yelling, the storm of words, the angry texts and desperate calls. They had braced themselves for blame and guilt tripping. Maybe they even wanted it. That kind of chaos, familiar, noisy, emotional, was something they could understand and manipulate. But you didn't give them any of that. Instead, you gave them nothing. And it was in that nothing that everything began to fall apart. You see, when you walk away quietly, you don't just remove yourself physically. You remove the supply of validation they were feeding on. You withdraw the emotional energy that made them feel important, powerful, in control. People like that thrive on reaction. They rely on it. Your pain, your outrage, your desperation. It used to be their confirmation that they still had influence over you, that they still mattered, that you were still theirs in some twisted way, but you took that away. You didn't scream. You didn't argue. You didn't demand an apology. You just stopped showing up. You disappeared from the emotional battlefield and left them to fight only with their conscience. That's the part they weren't prepared for, because they could deflect, they could project, they could manipulate reality so long as you were part of the conversation. But silence doesn't argue. Silence doesn't defend. Silence doesn't explain. And because of that, it becomes a mirror. A brutal, unrelenting mirror that reflects their actions back at them with perfect clarity. It forces them to consider the possibility that they were wrong, that they pushed too far, that they destroyed something good, and no amount of charm or excuses can undo that. They thought they had time. They thought you'd always come back, that your loyalty was unconditional, that even if they hurt you, disrespected you, took you for granted, you'd still be there, explaining yourself, trying to fix things, trying to get closure. They underestimated you in the worst way because they didn't realize how dangerous a quiet person becomes when they finally decide to walk away. Not because they are afraid to fight, but because they no longer see the point in fighting for someone who never truly saw them. And so the silence begins to torment them, not because it's loud, but because it's consistent. It doesn't waver. It doesn't give hints of return. It doesn't soothe their ego or give them false hope. It just exists like a void they can't fill, a punishment they can't escape, a consequence they never expected. The quiet forces them to remember. Every moment they dismissed you, every time they made you feel like your emotions were too much, every lie, every manipulation, every betrayal, it all comes back, louder in their minds than any argument could have been. You walking away quietly stripped them of control. They lost the ability to steer the narrative because as long as you were still engaging, they had power. They could twist your words, redirect the blame, make you doubt yourself. But when you said nothing, you denied them the chance to rewrite the ending. And that ending, silent, cold, final, left them alone with their thoughts. That's when regret creeps in, when the denial wears off, when they start to feel the real weight of what they lost. Not just a person, but someone who cared deeply, who gave wholeheartedly, who stood by them long after they deserved it. They thought they broke you, but what they actually did was set you free. And the silence, that wasn't weakness. That was strength in its purest form. Because anyone can scream in anger. Anyone can beg for closure. But it takes a deeply grounded person to walk away with dignity, to choose peace over chaos, and to let someone sit with the pain they caused without needing to witness it. There is something about silence that speaks to the soul. It is uncomfortable for those who are guilty. It magnifies every wrong move. It forces introspection. That's why it's so destructive. Not because you wish them harm, but because you didn't. Because you finally chose yourself. Because you didn't need to win the argument or prove your worth or hear them admit their fault. You were done. And that certainty, that clarity, it shattered them. They don't tell you how much it hurts when someone stops fighting for you, when they no longer explain what you did wrong, when they stop trying to salvage the connection. There's a special kind of devastation that comes with being ignored by the very person who once cared so much. It forces you to realize you've lost something meaningful without any hope of getting it back. And that realization can destroy a person from the inside out. That's the power of walking away quietly. It's not about making a scene. It's not about revenge. It's about reclaiming your energy. It's about recognizing that your worth isn't up for debate and that your peace isn't something to be compromised for people who only understand value when it's gone. You didn't destroy them with hatred. You destroyed them with indifference. You refused to keep pouring into a cup that was always meant to remain empty. In the end, your silence did more damage than 1,000 words ever could, because it didn't just remove you from their life, it forced them to confront the reasons why you had to go, and now they live with that echo, the echo of your absence, the echo of your strength, the echo of the love they lost, not because it wasn't real, but because they weren't ready for it. You walked away quietly, and in doing so, you left behind not just a silence, but a reckoning. They didn't understand what they were doing when they underestimated you. It was subtle at first, the offhand comments, the dismissals of your emotions, the constant taking without gratitude. You offered your loyalty with sincerity, thinking it would be seen for the gift it truly was, but they saw it as a default setting, something they could depend on without ever nurturing. You stayed through their chaos, through their moods, through the moments when they gave you every reason to leave. You stayed because loyalty to you was sacred, but to them it became routine, and routine became invisible. You didn't ask for much. You weren't demanding. You didn't come with a checklist of conditions. You brought your soul, your attention, your support, and your forgiveness, even when it was not earned. They mistook that for weakness. They assumed you needed them more than they needed you. They assumed that your heart was an endless source of comfort, something they could withdraw from again and again without ever depositing back. But what they never understood was that loyalty from a strong person is not an obligation. It's a decision that can be reversed the moment it is no longer respected. They thought you were staying because you had no other choice, because you were too afraid to be alone, because you were too attached, too soft, too vulnerable. But the truth is, you stayed because you saw something in them. You believed in their potential, not just who they were in the moment. You saw the cracks, the flaws, the self-destruction, and you still offered love. You stayed not out of weakness, but out of strength. You endured the pain of being dismissed, of being misunderstood, of being unappreciated because you wanted to give them the space to grow. You hoped your loyalty would be a bridge, not a chain. But over time, something inside you shifted. The weight of being constantly overlooked, constantly disregarded, started to wear you down. You realized that love without reciprocation is not loyalty, it's self-neglect. That constantly justifying their actions while silencing your own needs wasn't noble, it was eroding your spirit. And in that quiet moment of realization, you saw them for who they were, not for who you wanted them to become. You saw the truth, and that truth hurt, but it also set you free. They noticed the shift too, though they may not have admitted it. Maybe it was the way you stopped explaining yourself, the way you stopped reacting, the way you stopped waiting for them to change. They noticed that the light in your eyes was dimmer, that your presence was quieter, not broken, but distant. And then when you finally walked away, they were blindsided. Not because you left, but because they never imagined you would. They believed their own illusion, that you needed them more than they needed you, but you didn't. You just loved them more than they knew how to handle. And now, in your absence, they finally feel the depth of what they lost. Because loyalty like yours is not common, it's not replaceable, it's not something they can find in the next person they meet. Your loyalty was forged in patience, in understanding, in sacrifice, and they mistook it for something passive. But now they see it was the very foundation of everything good they had, and that foundation is gone. They replay moments in their head now, the times you comforted them when no one else did, the times you defended them even when they didn't deserve it, the times you put their needs before your own. And it dawns on them in the silence of your absence that they were not just losing a partner, a friend, a confidant. They were losing someone who chose them again and again in moments when walking away would have been easier. And now they sit with the emptiness that choice once filled. It's painful to be undervalued by the very people you love the most. But what they didn't understand is that your loyalty wasn't endless. It was strong, yes, but not blind. You were willing to go through the fire with them, but not for them to throw you in it. You could carry their pain, but not be the target of it. You could forgive mistakes, but not tolerate repeated disrespect. And once you reached that point of clarity, there was no turning back. They assumed you would always be there, that no matter how many times they pushed, you would stay, that no matter how little they gave, you would give more, that no matter how often they dismissed your needs, you would minimize them. But they were wrong, because you were not a doormat. You were a warrior, and warriors don't waste their fight on those who weaponize their love against them. You walked away, not because you gave up, but because you realized it was never your battle to begin with. You can't save someone who refuses to see their reflection in the hurt they cause. You can't heal in a place that's constantly reopening your wounds. You can't pour loyalty into a vessel that was never meant to hold it, and that's what destroyed them in the end. Not your words, not your anger, but your absence, the realization that the person they thought would never leave finally did, and not with rage, but with resolve. The silence you left behind forced them to listen to the very things they ignored while you were present. And the loyalty they once disrespected now echoes in their emptiness, reminding them of everything they thought they could live without. They'll look for you in others. They'll try to replace what they didn't appreciate, but it won't be the same because your loyalty wasn't about attachment. It was about depth. And people like you don't show up twice. They had their chance. They fumbled it. And now they carry the weight of knowing they destroyed the one thing that would have stood by them through anything, if only they had treated it like it mattered. They didn't realize you were their mirror, not in the literal sense, but in the emotional, spiritual sense. You were the reflection they relied on to feel human, stable, even good. They projected their chaos into the world, and you absorbed it with patience. They dismissed others, but you listened. They wore masks with everyone else, but you saw beneath them. And in doing so, you became something more than just a person in their life. You became a sanctuary, a place where they could fall apart and still be accepted, a soul that made their fractured identity feel whole, even if only temporarily. They didn't know how much of themselves they were holding together through your presence until it was gone, because your emotional strength became their shield. Your belief in them covered their self-doubt. Your consistency masked their instability. They looked into your eyes and saw someone who believed in them more than they believed in themselves. And for a while, that was enough. It was enough to keep them going, enough to keep them from confronting the darkness within. But here's what they never realized. When a person leans too heavily on someone else for their sense of identity without offering mutual respect, it becomes a form of silent destruction. You were reflecting back the goodness they longed to see in themselves. You gave them compassion, and they mistook it for validation. You gave them patience, and they mistook it for weakness. You gave them your understanding, and they mistook it for permission to continue their behavior. What they saw in you wasn't just kindness. It was their only connection to the version of themselves they wanted to believe existed. But that illusion wasn't sustainable because you weren't a therapist. You weren't a savior. You were a human being trying to love someone who wouldn't do the work of loving themselves. The moment you left, the illusion cracked. And they were left with their own reflection, no more validation, no more soothing presence, no more spiritual safety net, just them, their guilt, and the reality of who they'd become. And that is what truly haunts them. It's not just your absence, it's the sudden confrontation with themselves. Because when you were there, they could avoid accountability. They could spin the narrative. But now, without your light to soften the truth, they see it in full clarity, and it's terrifying. You were the calm in their storm, and now all they're left with is the storm. The silence you left behind forces introspection. They begin to question who they are, why they pushed away someone who only ever wanted to help them heal, grow, and love better. They begin to hear their own excuses for what they are, empty, fragile attempts to avoid change. and they start to remember the moments you tried to hold them accountable, the times you gently pointed out the damage they were causing, the boundaries you eventually set, and the pain they caused you. But now there's no one left to argue with, no one left to redirect the blame to, just themselves. And that's the mirror they cannot escape. They might try to find comfort in others. They might try to surround themselves with noise, distractions, people who validate their version of the story, but it won't work because none of those people are you. None of them know the real version of them the way you did. None of them held space for their brokenness and still chose to see beauty. That kind of connection doesn't fade from memory. It lingers. It becomes a ghost they carry. And that ghost will appear in quiet moments, in a conversation where your name isn't mentioned but your presence is missed, in a new relationship where the other person doesn't understand them the way you did, in the silence of the night when they feel empty and don't know why. They'll remember how you saw through the walls they built, how you stayed even when they tried to push you away. And they'll realize that the reason they feel so lost now is because they burned the only bridge that ever truly led them home. You were their emotional mirror, but you were also their moral compass. You challenged them to be better, not with force, but with example. You lived with integrity. You held yourself accountable. You communicated with maturity, and they saw that, but they didn't rise to meet it. They expected you to lower your standards, to bend until you broke, but you didn't, and that's what they now regret. Not just losing you, but losing the opportunity to become the version of themselves you believed they could be. They didn't understand the value of your presence because they were too consumed by their need to control the narrative. They couldn't admit that you were right about them, about the relationship, about what needed to change. And now that you're gone, the truth has caught up to them. It stares them down every day, and there's no escape. That's the price of losing someone who was a mirror, not of who they were, but who they could have been. You didn't leave with hatred. You left with wisdom. You didn't burn the bridge. They destroyed it by refusing to walk across it with honesty. And now, as they sit alone with their reflection, they finally understand what you were trying to show them all along. That love isn't just about being seen. It's about being willing to see yourself through the eyes of someone who wants the best for you and doing the hard work of living up to it. They couldn't do that, so now they're left with themselves. And the mirror doesn't lie. You didn't yell. You didn't break things. You didn't plot revenge or post bitter quotes online. You just found peace. And that peace, that unbothered glow, that emotional detachment, that's what became their punishment. Not because you intended to hurt them. You weren't out to destroy them. In fact, you were probably too exhausted to even think of revenge. You had given so much of yourself, your patience, your trust, your loyalty, that by the time you left, you didn't have the energy to be angry. You just wanted to breathe again, to sleep without feeling drained, to walk through life without being made to feel like you were never enough. So you chose peace, and that's what cut the deepest. You see, people like that expect chaos. They expect retaliation. It gives them a reason to vilify you. It helps them justify their own behavior. If you fight back, they can point the finger and say, "See, this is why I did what I did." But when you don't give them that, when you instead choose silence, healing, and forward motion, it leaves them with nothing but themselves and the weight of what they did. Your peace removes their ability to deflect. It leaves them face to face with the consequences of their actions. And for someone who's never taken responsibility for anything, that kind of exposure is unbearable. They may not say it. They may pretend like they're unaffected. They may even post photos that scream, "I've moved on," but deep inside, your peace taunts them because the very thing they thought would break you, your absence, has made you stronger. You began to glow. You started to smile again. You stopped shrinking to make others comfortable. And that transformation, the one they secretly hoped would never happen, became undeniable. You weren't bitter. You were better. And that fact alone became a constant reminder of what they lost. They thought you'd crumble. They thought you needed them more than you needed yourself. They thought you would be waiting in the shadows, hoping for an apology, praying for a reunion. but you weren't. You were healing. You were rebuilding. You were discovering the parts of yourself that got buried under all the trying, the explaining, the hoping. And the more you grew into that healed version of you, the more uncomfortable they became, because nothing terrifies a guilty conscience more than the person it tried to destroy, rising in peace with no desire for revenge. Your peace spoke louder than any confrontation ever could. It said, I'm not angry, I'm done. It said, you no longer have access to me, not because I hate you, but because I finally remembered who I am. That kind of peace is unsettling to someone who counted on your emotional chaos to soothe their own guilt. And now that chaos is gone, you're calm, you're whole, you're unavailable. And they're left to deal with the truth that the damage they caused wasn't just a phase, it was a turning point, one you'll never return from. And now they begin to see the long-term cost of their short-term pleasure. The decisions they made that hurt you, the lies, the gaslighting, the betrayals, those weren't just moments. They were fractures that over time became fault lines. And when the final break happened, it wasn't dramatic, it was quiet, but it was final. And now that you're gone, they finally understand what they gave up. Not just a person, but a future, a real connection, a rare soul who chose love in the face of pain, who showed up even when they weren't being met with the same energy. They'll see you thriving now, and it will sting, not because you're flaunting it, but because you don't need them to thrive. You never did. You just forgot that for a while. And now that you remember, your growth is unstoppable. You no longer feel the need to prove your worth to someone who treated it like it was disposable. You no longer beg for clarity or closure. You no longer seek validation from someone who only saw your value when you walked away. That peace you carry now, it's not accidental, it's earned. It came through nights of crying yourself to sleep, through the pain of untangling your self-worth from their rejection, through the discipline of not reacting when every part of you wanted to scream. It came from choosing solitude over disrespect, self-respect over validation, boundaries over chaos. And now that you have it, you protect it fiercely. Because once you taste peace, you never go back to begging for attention from people who thrive in conflict. And that's the reality they live with now, not the one they show others, but the one they face when the distractions fade, when the noise settles, and they're left alone with the memory of you, a peaceful you, a resilient you, a version of you they never thought you'd become. That version of you is a mirror they can't avoid, a reflection of what they lost, and a constant reminder that their actions have consequences that don't scream, but echo quietly and powerfully in the space you once filled. So, while they try to pretend they're unaffected, deep down they know the truth. You didn't break them with vengeance. You broke them with grace. You didn't burn their life down. You just left. And in doing so, you took the warmth, the light, the comfort, and that empty space, that cold silence. That's their punishment, not because you chose to harm them, but because you finally chose to heal.